Okay, so we left with thinking about utilitarianism, and then now we're carrying on with negative utilitarianism, okay? So I made a lot of noise about making sure that we understood it as utilitarianism as consequentialist. We could likewise see negative utilitarianism as consequentialist. And again, we're basing the value of the moral action on the consequences, not necessarily the actions themselves. In other words, the actions themselves are not where the moral value lies for a utilitarian. It's whether or not the value lies in whether or not it brought about your action brought about the most amount of happiness for the most amount of people, okay? So it's normative, and likewise it's consequential, to be differentiated from natural law and likewise virtue ethics. And then what is the tie-in to negative utilitarianism? I love negative utilitarianism because it accounts for ways of understanding that are not quite the traditional utilitarian way of understanding, and that is the difference between happiness and suffering. So in other words, a traditional utilitarian is going to consider how we're thinking of ethics, the value in terms of happiness and pleasure, okay, as we saw with Bentham and Mill. Whereas a negative utilitarian, as thought of by Karl Popper, who was philosophy of science, and he was interested in the falsifiability problem in terms of philosophy of science. But apart from the falsifiability, he also had this idea of negative utilitarianism, and part of this comes from his past in World War II with his Jewish heritage in terms of the way that we're understanding happiness can also bring about problems where we think we might just give value only to happiness and not necessarily to suffering. So one way to think about that is for Karl Popper. His emphasis is on the reduction of suffering. So in other words, what we're doing is we're looking for the most quantity of and quality of the way in which suffering is reduced. Okay, so it's traditional. It has all the elements of traditional utilitarianism, except that instead of advocating for happiness, it's thinking that the Karl Popper is thinking that the importance of negative utilitarianism is in that it's a reduction of suffering. So you're maximizing your reduction of suffering, okay? And so with the maximizing of reduction of suffering, that's different than maximizing happiness. So like for instance, I like to give the example of Black Lives Matter, because with Black Lives Matter, one thing that's of key importance is that people are not necessarily aiming for happiness, they're aiming for the poor treatment that results in the death of black men in the hands of white police officers, right? Okay, so in other words, they're not necessarily aiming for happiness, they just want the unfair treatment to stop, okay? So that's probably the easiest way to understand negative utilitarianism in practice. And also, let's say in an environmental sense, one way that we could think of utilitarianism is as a reduction of suffering for animals as well. So a famous utilitarian singer, 20th century guy, he's still alive as a matter of fact, in his way of thinking about animal rights, he argues that animals deserve to not suffer. So in other words, if we're thinking of our treatment of animals as being morally questionable, from a negative utilitarian sense, we're thinking of that in terms of the reduction of suffering for the animal, right? That in other words, we're not bringing about happiness in animals, we're bringing about a reduction of suffering, and that's where we're starting out, right? And so that's what's really important to understand about negative utilitarianism, because negative utilitarianism is starting out with the reduction of suffering, and that usually seems to cover more ground in terms of how we understand it. So we might even think of, say, the Hippocratic Oath. So if you think about the Hippocratic Oath that a physician takes in terms of not wanting to do harm, or to heal someone is to not bring about harm, that in other words, the not bringing about harm aspect is a reduction of suffering, right? That in other words, it's going to be better that you reduce suffering rather than bringing about happiness, right? That in other words, your aim is not to bring about happiness, it's there to reduce the suffering, right? So that's a way to think about it. And also I gave you some environmental ways to think about it. And then likewise, a way to critique traditional utilitarianism in the sense that traditional utilitarianist view would have us considering what is producing happiness, what is the consequence of happiness, then that is giving us something where we're not necessarily paying attention to the underlying suffering that we have, that the cry for happiness is overlooking. So in other words, if we're only focusing on happiness, we might not be as focused on the reduction of suffering. And oftentimes when we think about it, the reduction of suffering seems to be a little more, you're covering more people. So if even negative utilitarianism is consequentialist and likewise based on quantities of people, so if you're reducing the most amount of suffering, then the value there is in terms of its reach for the most amount of people, right? And likewise, if we even tie in animals, we could say animals, non-sentient beings, and the environment, okay? So if we take that as a starting point for our understanding of utilitarianism in contrast to negative utilitarianism, I think we'll be doing good. Yes, so we'll take it from there and talk to you later. Bye-bye.